about Jewish space lasers? Tell us about Jewish space lasers.
No, why don't you go talk about Jewish space lasers? And really, why don't you f*** off? How about that?
Well, folks, in another foray into unorthodox weather-related commentary, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has yet again captured national attention. This time by suggesting one of the most unhinged crackpot plans to address the California wildfires that have ravaged Southern California since last week. But she's also not the only conservative nutjob saying it. And probably worst of all, in their partisan attempts to play the blame game, they have all missed out on a culprit that nobody seems to be talking about, who may not have started the fire, but whose corruption has made it thousands of times more devastating and heartbreaking for the real people affected.
The LA fire should be a wake-up call about the predatory nature of the insurance industry. Several insurance companies canceled a total of 2.8 million customers' insurance policies across the state, including 531,000 policies in Los Angeles County, saying they just didn't want to deal with the risk of it anymore. Why do we tolerate a system where people get rich by manufacturing suffering and misery? The media keeps calling this a natural disaster, but thousands of people losing their homes and entire families going completely bankrupt? That's man-made.
So let's break down what conspiracy crap Greene is gagging on this time, expose her and conservatives' idiocy for the world to see, and prove that unlike chivalry and the rule of law, science is not entirely dead, and then expose the real people who should be receiving the ire of the American public, insurance companies, while hopefully and rightfully adding to the backlash they've already been receiving for their heartless, corrupt system that is literally kicking devastated fire victims while they're down for profit. Now, Greene's first foray into fire-related conspiracies, of course, came back in 2018, where she famously claimed the California fires back then were caused by so-called Jewish space lasers owned by the Rothschilds.
What it was about, there were California wildfires, and I guess you read an article in like a scientific magazine talking about harnessing solar energy in space. Yeah.
But don't worry, it wasn't anti-Semitic though, because she didn't know the Rothschilds were Jewish.
But I didn't know anything about their religion or anything like that. I was just making a post.
And as we'll see in a second, while today's example from Greene wasn't quite as far out as that, she was far from the only one hawking conspiracies about the fires and climate change in recent days. Even Mel Gibson, who found out he lost his house in the fires while on Joe Rogan's podcast, had this to say about arguably the biggest culprit in the fire, climate change.
And I just I look at all sorts of stuff like that, the icebergs melting and the water overflowing.
It's not.
Ever have a glass full of ice and watched it melt? Did you ever see the glass flow over?
Here, look. Here's a glass of ice water. Hey, that ice isn't making the water overflow because it's already in the water. But imagine there's a whole bunch of other ice that's not in the water. It's on the land. You know, the part where the water isn't. And then when temperatures rise and the land ice melts enough to fall, everywhere! It's everywhere!
So Greene, who also famously and stupidly claimed the government controls the weather after Hurricane Helene, decided to lend her unhelpful hand by proposing this. Why don't they use geoengineering like cloud seeding to bring rain down on the wildfires in California? They know how to do it. And look, even though that sounds at first to a layman like proposing a government-mandated rain dance, cloud seeding is actually a real thing. It's a real weather modification technique that increases the likelihood of a cloud producing rain or snow, and it involves introducing tiny particles into a cloud to help water droplets freeze and form ice crystals. But here's the problem. Greene's post was almost immediately community noted with an abundance of sources that show cloud seeding is ineffective during dry weather, e.g. a drought, because it relies on the presence of existing moisture in the clouds to work. And Southern California, which lives in a perpetual state of drought, was of course in a severe drought before and during the fire, so Democrats controlling the clouds wouldn't have worked either way. And before we see the real and dangerous impact her words have on the MAGA misinformed public, it's important to note that the real devastation here in the aftermath of what has already happened is being muddied by this mis and disinformation, because what we should be focusing on instead, that most of the media unfortunately is not, is the fact that major insurers in California canceled hundreds of thousands of people's policies right before these fires happened, leaving the victims with little to no recourse for their homes. And I mean, this is insane. Just look at the drought of coverage of this major issue. Of course, most of the coverage initially was rightly focused on updates, safety, and evacuation notices, but with regard to insurers dropping coverage and fleeing the state just before these fires, we can see at least initially there were only roughly 40 total news sources covering what should arguably be a much bigger part of the conversation. And when you compare the headlines, you start to see some interesting framing. On the left, you have some outlets using somewhat loaded language like devastating or inferno down here, and framing the narrative as an urgent climate crisis exacerbated by insufficient insurance coverage, while the right strongly attributes the crisis to Governor Gavin Newsom's policies, presenting a politically charged perspective that blames the governments for insufficient risk management and increasing insurance challenges. And some of these changes in language or slant are more subtle than others, but they obviously change how readers view the story, which is incredibly important to keep in mind, especially as our news landscape becomes more fractured and leaves us susceptible to more mis- and disinformation, or even just information coming from a source with a heavy corporate influence. And this analysis is all possible thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. Personally, I specifically found immense usefulness and often a little bit of humor from the Ground News blind spot feature that highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. Like this story, for instance, underreported on the right about doctors urging the Senate not to confirm RFK Jr., or this one underreported on the left about the Lake and Riley Act overwhelmingly clearing its first Senate hurdle. And this is so important so we don't live in an echo chamber and get misled by subtle and sometimes not so subtle language in the news. So thank you to Ground News for the work that they do and for sponsoring this video, and you can try out Ground News today by clicking the link on screen in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen, and if you sign up through our link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what we at Really American use to get unlimited access to all the features. By doing so, not only are you supporting the channel and Ground News' work, but also arming yourself with knowledge and information that is utterly crucial in today's news media landscape. Case in point here being that not only do Greene's comments have a real-world impact on a misinformed public,
I think there was an upcoming storm, and then I think government set in with whatever it is that they do. I don't know all the specifics about it. I'm not an expert in cloud seeding or whatever it is that they use.
but they also shift the narrative away from a deeper and more addressable issue.
7 of the 12 largest insurance companies by market share in California either paused or restricted issuing new policies in the state. State Farm discontinued coverage for 72,000 houses and apartments in California last year, dropping nearly 70% of its market share in Pacific Palisades.
This choice has left what probably amounts to hundreds of thousands of people in LA County having no fire insurance right now because their insurance company canceled their plan. If any of these people lose their homes in these fires, they will essentially lose everything.
I don't even have a toothbrush. I don't even have toothpaste. I mean, just think of all the stuff in your house, and you're starting from scratch.
Some people who had their plans canceled were able to switch to the state government's fire insurance plan called the FAIR Plan, but the FAIR Plan receives no taxpayer support whatsoever, making the plan extremely expensive for what amounts to bare bones coverage. While the state is assuring people that all the damage will be covered, customers will almost certainly foot the bill in the form of higher premiums. Now, the media is talking about the insurance crisis like it's a matter of bad policy or bad management. But the real problem is, insurance under capitalism is inherently predatory, corrupt, and directly incentivizes this exact type of behavior that we're seeing right now.
These are for-profit insurance companies. And so if they can't make a profit, they're going to leave the area. And that's exactly what happened. And it's legal. They don't have to keep doing business in California. Is it ethical? No.
In short, cheating, lying, and stealing are inherent to the capitalist system because dishonest behavior is profitable. Insurance companies cheat their customers out of coverage because they keep more of the money that way. Pharmaceutical companies are probably kicking the can down the road on curing major diseases because they know that once they cure a disease, they won't have patients buying their pills every month. Honesty and morality are incompatible with profitable business practice, period. Why do we tolerate a system where people get rich by manufacturing suffering and misery? Why do we tolerate a system where people are rewarded with yachts and mansions for denying help to people on the worst days of their lives? The media keeps calling this a natural disaster, but thousands of people losing their homes and entire families going completely bankrupt, that's man-made. Not to mention, these insurance companies are quite literally making record profits off of our suffering, and we're supposed to feel sorry for them? At what point are we going to decide that we can't live like this anymore?
So Marjorie can sit there and spew nonsense all she wants, but when are we going to talk about what recourse these devastated families actually have? Because frankly, it's next to nothing.
Nonprofits have stepped up to help these victims with money and shelter, and many of these victims are using GoFundMe to raise money to replace everything they lost too, as they await for potential relief from the federal government.
And that is what the heart of the conversation about this disaster should be in its aftermath. Why are we accepting this? For-profit insurance, for-profit healthcare that is incentivized and makes money via real human suffering. And until we start to recognize that and join together as Americans against corporations and companies that profit off our suffering, we will continue to unfortunately have and elect people to our government as stupid and unconcerned with our own livelihood and well-being as Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video and this important work. Check out the link in the description down below to help fight misinformation. And consider supporting the Really American channel by dropping a like and subscribing to the channel. For Really American, I'm Kenny Hesse, and I'll see you all in the next one.